Noel, the Know-All Gnome by Jane Launchbury. Underneath the Christmas tree sat a very odd-shaped present. When her husband wasn't looking, Mrs. Jones squeezed it, shook it, poked it, and looked at it from all angles, but she couldn't work out what it could possibly be. It was obviously going to be a lovely surprise. On Christmas morning, Mr. Jones picked up the present and gave it to his wife. "This is for you, darling," he said with a big smile. "I hope you like it." Mrs. Jones took a deep breath and started to tear off the wrapping paper. A bright red shiny hat appeared with bright yellow spots. Underneath the hat was a bright pink face with a shiny red nose. Mrs. Jones gave a gasp as she pulled off the rest of the wrapping paper, for it revealed the most ghastly garden gnome she had ever seen. The colors were so bright that she thought they would probably glow in the dark. "I just knew you'd love him," said Mr. Jones happily. "He's an extra special deluxe limited edition gnome," he added, "of very superior quality. I thought we could call him Noel, seeing that it's Christmas." "What a good idea," muttered Mrs. Jones, picking up the gnome by his big shiny nose and rushing for the back door. "I can't wait to put him out in the garden." She hurried down the garden path, wondering wherever her husband could have found quite such a dreadful creature. She had never liked garden gnomes, and this one seemed a particularly awful specimen. He was so unbelievably bright and shiny, and he had a very snooty smile. Mrs. Jones resisted the temptation to throw the gnome into the pond. She plunked him down behind a bush instead, and hoped she wouldn't be able to see him from the house. But Noel's colors were so bright that he stood out from the rest of the garden like a sore thumb. When she had disappeared inside, Noel the gnome stretched his legs and peered down his nose at his new surroundings. He didn't like what he saw. This was no place for a gnome of his superior quality. It was far too dull and dreary. All those boring browns and greens would have to go for a start, and he immediately began planning how he would set about changing things for the better. If Mrs. Jones didn't like the new gnome, the real gnomes and fairies that lived in the garden weren't too pleased either. They had never seen anything quite like Noel before, and as soon as they were sure that there was no one about, they crept out of the trees and bushes to have a closer look. Noel didn't see them coming, of course, because real gnomes and fairies blend in so well with their surroundings that they are almost invisible. Noel was bending down, polishing his shiny shoes until he could see his bright pink face in them, when he realized that there were other faces reflected in them too. He looked up, and for the first time, he noticed the gnomes and fairies around him. He sniffed and peered down his nose at the soft gray and brown creatures. They looked to him as though they could all do with a good wash, and being a superior sort of gnome who believed in speaking his mind, he told them so. Then, just for good measure, he added that he thought everything in the garden needed a good wash and a few coats of color, and he was going to have to do something about it. Then he realized that he still hadn't introduced himself. "My name is Noel, and I'm an extra special deluxe limited edition gnome," he announced grandly. "No-oh," said one of the fairies thoughtfully. "That's a very unusual name." It didn't take long for the fairies and gnomes to decide that Noel was in fact a very good name for the new gnome. He seemed to think he knew everything, and he had a way of looking down his big red nose at everyone that made them feel very uncomfortable. But they were kind creatures, So they all decided to try and make him feel at home. Then one day, Noel pushed his luck a bit too far. He got up very early in the morning, mixed up gallons of brightly colored paints, and set about improving the color scheme in the garden. By the time the other gnomes and fairies realized what he was doing, he had painted all the tree trunks bright orange with turquoise spots and was cheerfully painting the lawn pink with purple stripes. The fairies and gnomes were horrified, and they all had to work very hard to put things back to normal before Mr. and Mrs. Jones woke up. They decided that something had to be done about Noel. But what? In the end, it was Mrs. Jones who dealt with the situation. She had been getting more and more fed up with seeing Noel glowing among the bushes, and on this particular morning he seemed brighter than ever. "I hate that ugly gnome. He's a real eyesore," she grumbled as she put out some bread for the birds. She knew she couldn't throw him in the dustbin, but she didn't see any harm in temporarily losing him. So she looked around the garden for somewhere to hide him and noticed the compost heap. That would do nicely. She took a big spade and dug a deep hole right in the middle. Then she picked up Noel, dropped him into the hole, and piled the compost back on top of him. The fairies and gnomes couldn't believe their luck. But the strange thing was that life simply wasn't the same without Noel around. Although he had been an eyesore and a bossy know-all, most of the fairies and gnomes had to admit that they had admired his enthusiasm and energy. It was just the way he went about things that was all wrong. Even Mrs. Jones felt there was something missing from the garden, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. At first, Noel had been absolutely furious about being buried in the compost heap, but there was nothing he could do about it. Then he started to feel sorry for himself. Deep under the compost, he began to wonder what it was he had done wrong. Perhaps being an extra special deluxe limited edition gnome wasn't quite so wonderful after all. He only knew he was superior because Mr. Jones had said so, and what if Mr. Jones was wrong? He certainly didn't look like any of the other gnomes, and then there was the matter of the improvements. Even he had to admit that the garden had looked a bit odd after he tried changing the color scheme. He was still wondering about this when he heard the sound of digging above him. Some of the fairies and gnomes had felt so sorry for Noel that they had decided to rescue him. They very nearly missed him, for instead of the bright colors they had been expecting, Noel was coated from head to foot in sticky brown compost. "You look as though you need a good wash," observed a tall brown gnome, and for once Noel had the sense to say not a word. He was carried over to the pond, where they set about scrubbing the compost off with tiny scrubbing brushes. At first, no one noticed what was happening. Then they realized that not only was the compost coming off, but so too were those dreadful bright colors. Underneath, Noel was a lovely shade of sandy brown. They scrubbed away until all the colors had come off, and Noel looked just like an ordinary gnome. He stared at his reflection and had to admit that it was a distinct improvement. He even heard several fairies comment about his good looks. No one ever did work out quite what had happened to Noel in the compost heap, but he was a changed character afterwards. Instead of telling everyone what to do, he asked their advice. And when spring came, he learned to love the colors of nature, though he always liked the brighter ones best of all. And he turned out to be a very good gardener. As for the Joneses, they had the most glorious garden in the village. Mr. Jones always said jokingly that it must have been because of Noel. though he had been most upset about the way all his colors had washed off in the rain. Mrs. Jones just smiled. She never did work out how he had got out of the compost heap, nor how he had lost his snooty smile and gained a very endearing twinkle in his brown eyes.